This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Hi everyone, I'm Keith McVilly, the Scope University of Melbourne Professorial Fellow in Disability and Inclusion, situated in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Welcome to our webinar today on co-design or consultation, exploring barriers and enablers to true collaboration in the disability and community services sector. This webinar is being conducted as part of the University of Melbourne and Scope Partnership's contribution to National Social Sciences Week. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the country and the people's sovereign lands on which we meet today. Our First Nations people have never ceded sovereignty of their lands and have been the custodians of these lands for over 70,000 years. Let's acknowledge that custodianship and that sovereignty, and let's also acknowledge the wisdom of the elders of our First Nations people, the wisdom of the country on which we meet, the wisdom of the seas around and the skies above. And let us commit ourselves to the ongoing work of reconciliation and the creation of a truly inclusive society. Thank you so much for tuning in today, to those who are here in the room with us, albeit virtually, and those who might be watching the recorded session later on. We've had lots of interest in this seminar, and we've certainly had lots of interest from people who have indicated that they want the recording. So that's one of the wonders of the Zoom world these days. I'm just going to walk you through a few housekeeping matters before we start the session. And the first thing I would like to mention is that this session is fully captioned. You can view the captions by clicking the small CC icon at the bottom of your screen and then selecting Show Subtitle. Our presenters today will be exploring the perceptions of what true co-design and co-production is. And we're going to be examining both the enablers and the barriers to co-design and co-production in the disability sector. But a lot of what we talk today could also be applied more broadly in the community services sector. For our panel today, we have 4 experts in the field, and we're very lucky to have the expertise available to us. First up, we have got Zane McKenzie. Zane is the Client Partnership Lead and Disability Workstream Lead at Scope Australia. Zane is a person with the lived experience of cerebral palsy, who's been a facilitator and an educator in disability awareness and engagement. And over the past several years, Zane has been a fantastic contributor to both our undergraduate and postgraduate programs here at the University of Melbourne as part of the Scope Partnership. Zane is an experienced leader who brings over 40 years experience in the disability sector, and he's very passionate about coaching people and organisations. Today, Zane will reflect on his professional and indeed personal experiences when working with people with disabilities in many different ways, including in consultation, co-design, and importantly, co-production processes. We're also very lucky to be joined today by Alison Stanier. Alison is the Customer Participation Manager at Scope Australia. She holds a Bachelor of Applied Science in Disability Studies and is an experienced disability professional with over 15 years experience in our sector. Alison has an extensive background in case management and service leadership and is very committed to amplifying the voices and aspirations of people with disability. Alison works with Scope and her work is pivotal to the role of creating an inclusive environment that ensures meaningful participation and indeed the co-design and co-production of Scope services with people with lived experience. We're also joined today by Rusty Benson. Rusty is a very experienced social designer, known across the sector for his very empathic and collaborative work and his reflexive approaches in designing policies and services with people who are most affected by those services. He's known as an exceptional facilitator and relationship builder who can connect with people at all levels within an organisation and to bring them together to drive change and to champion co-design and co-production. He brings extensive experience in the co-design and co-production processes across the disability and the broader community service sectors. And last but not least, we're joined by my much esteemed colleague and dear friend, Dr. Paul Ramcharan. Paul is the Senior Research Fellow in Disability and Inclusion as part of the Scope University of Melbourne partnership in the School of the Social and Political Sciences here at the University of Melbourne. Paul has 30 years of unbroken track record in research and development across the disability services sector. And I had the privilege of first meeting Paul some 20 or so years ago when I was working in the UK. He holds a number of important leadership roles in research for the commissioning of national and state governments. And Paul's current work in relation to disability and inclusion encompasses a very strong human rights-based approach to the reduction of regulated restrictive practices here in Victoria and indeed nationally. He is very committed to furthering choice and self-determination by people with disability and in supporting the self-advocacy sector. So, where I'd like to start off with today is to bring your attention to the co-design ladder. And I think it's really important that as we start today, we clearly distinguish the processes that have been up and have been used in the disability services sector over several years. Here we have the co-design ladder on the screen. I was in fact only discussing this with my master's class early this week, and we were looking at issues both in the disability sector but also looking at issues more broadly in community services and amongst our First Nations people. And as you can see at the very bottom of the co-production ladder is coercion. And I think that this was most evident in the formation and the implementation of policies relating to our First Nations people in the stolen generation, where coercion was very much evident. We also saw such policy rollouts in our own disability sector, which led to the institutionalisation of people with disability, where people were told what was good for them and where they had to be. I would hope that in our sector we have moved well beyond coercive measures. Moving up the ladder, we have education. And indeed, we've done a lot of education of people with disabilities, education for families, education of our workforce. But again, education is really all about telling people what we think they should know, telling people what we think is the way to go about living your life and doing your job. And I think we need to do better and we need to work smarter. In so doing, moving up the ladder, we're starting to get better about informing people about policies and about what constitutes good practice. In the academic world, we publish papers based on our research. In the world of public and government policy, we're getting a little bit smarter about putting out plain language and easy English information to people. But again, necessary, but not sufficient. Certainly in recent years, we've been doing more and more consultation. And we'll talk a little bit today about some of the misconceptions between consultation and what constitutes co-design and co-production. Again, consultation, albeit important, is not sufficient in moving forward for the development of good policy and the delivery of evidence-informed and effective services that will make a difference in people's lives. The hinge point here is engagement. Are we going to simply move beyond telling people what a certain dominant group of people think is the way to live their lives, the way that services should be designed, or are we actually going to engage with those people for whom those services and those policies need to be developed? We need to engage with people, and we're going to talk about different ways of engagement today. Once we've got engagement underway, we then need to push ourselves that little bit further. We need to move into the co-design of policies and practices, and we need to furthermore move into the co-production and delivery of those policies and practices. And again, one of the things that I'm very keen on exploring in this world of co-design and co-production is drawing on our First Nations understanding of yarning, whereby we sit on the dirt together, we listen to each other deeply, we build trusting relationships, and we share our worldviews. And that's the basis, really, of co-design and co-production. So I think it's time to turn to our panel. And first up on our panel, I'm going to call to the floor Alison. And my question to you, Alison, in the work that you're doing with Scope Australia, why is Scope Australia so committed to building an environment of co-design and co-production? And how are you going about doing that?
Thanks, Keith. And really appreciate the question. I guess here at Scope, we have a really strong commitment to achieving our purpose and vision with the full participation of people with disability, those who use our services. And I guess for us, the challenge has been, how can we ensure that we meet this commitment? So what we've done is, to strengthen our organisational capability in participatory practice and shared decision-making, co-design, co-production, is to develop a client participation framework. Our framework draws inspiration from Einstein's ladder of citizen participation, as well as basing it on best practice guidance from healthcare, from government, mental health, and so forth. Our client participation framework is designed to involve clients in decision-making, service design and improvement, organisational evaluation, and governance. The framework provides guidance for client involvement in change processes and really ensuring that people with disability have a voice and influence over how this change occurs. Our ultimate goal with the framework is to ensure that client participation happens early, it happens systematically and with really genuine intent. So you'll see up on the screen that we've got up our model or our bit of a visual aid to of our client participation framework. And I appreciate that some of the writing there might be slightly small, so apologies for that, but it really is just there as a bit of a visual aid. But within this, we've got some concentric circles, which illustrates the varying levels and which align to the ladder of citizen participation, or even as you've already discussed, Keith, that ladder of co-production. And so within our framework, our levels are that we have in the outer circle inform, where clients receive information that helps them make the right decisions for themselves. And that's in an accessible format and a timely manner for them. Our next circle in, we have involve, and that's where clients have a say in the decision. It's the solution or the change. And we really are looking to actively seek their views and to respect what we hear. And then you keep moving in and we have collaborate, and that's where clients play a really key role in the decision, the solution or change. And I think a really practical way that we're doing that here at Scope is via our client advisory panel. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think Zane might refer to that in when he has a chance to speak. And then lastly, we've got empower, and that's where we really are looking towards creating opportunities for people with disability to take the lead in the solution and make that final decision. And here at Scope, we've got ambitions of creating a pathway to the board and ensuring that we create opportunities for people with disability to be involved at this level should they wish. And I think that's a key thing, that should they wish. Really key to this framework is that people can choose to what extent they wish to participate at a time that suits them. It's going to look different for each individual and it might vary over time. And I guess the one thing though that should remain consistent really is that participation is meaningful for them. So getting back to, when you look at our framework and consider where co-design would occur, I think it's really easy to immediately look at those kind of two central levels there, which is the collaborate and the empower level. And similarly, when you look at the ladder of citizen participation, or again, that ladder of co-production, it's really obvious that co-design occurs at those top rungs. I think the thing that I just want to point out, however, is that it's really important not to dismiss those lower rungs or those lower levels. And that's because you need these to reach that top point, that top goal of getting to co-design and co-production, because you can't always assume that people automatically know how to participate in the co-design process, or that they even understand what it means right from that outset. So really, to truly engage in co-design, that is to be able to define a problem, to identify solutions, to test options and evaluate those. It really involves a level of skill and knowledge. And so in my opinion, we must really see the goal of co-design as an opportunity to build capability. It's not just a method to take knowledge or expertise from people. We know that people with disability often need support to participate meaningfully. And so we just need to ensure that that we do what's shown in our diagram here, and in particular in the arrow here, is that at the same time that we seek to listen to, include, engage, involve our people with disability, that we also educate, we coach, we mentor along the way. So really, in conclusion, the way we're positioned here at Scope to build co-design and co-production into our practices is through the implementation of our client participation framework. It's been really important to create this because a model like this sets out clear opportunities, expectations, and capability uplift. And we feel that to reach that ultimate goal of engaging our clients in true co-design, that we will use this framework, and we will not only do that, but we will do it meaningfully, and we'll do it with purpose. So yeah, thanks.
Terrific, thanks, Alison. And we know that this is a long haul endeavour.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, in terms of making co-design and co-production work, people need information in formats that they can understand. Sometimes that's written, and sometimes that's in a conversation. People need education, and that can be delivered in so many different ways. And that all-important linchpin of being able to engage in trusting conversations. All this precedes the co-design and co-production process. Zane, I'd like to turn to you, though. You've been very involved in many of the processes underpinning Scope's move towards a commitment and an implementation of co-design and co-production. What does that mean for you as a person with lived experience? And what do you think are the practical steps that an organisation like Scope needs to put in place to make co-design and co-production just part of the DNA as to how you do things?
Yeah, it's a great question, Keith, and thank you very much for it. Look, first of all, I really want to compliment a point that Alison just made, because in the first instance, we need to understand how a person actually wants to participate and what is their appetite for participation. And then when you understand that, you need to understand first and foremost that as a person with disability, when we talk about co-design, what we are talking about, and certainly what it means from my perspective, is that I am involved in the entire process of identifying a problem to developing potential solutions, to implementing those, to testing them, to going back again, making the changes that need to be made, and then to evaluating the overall impact of the change and the initial problem statement that we started with. And the other thing about co-design, from a practical sense, in my humble opinion, is that it actually doesn't end. It's an ongoing process, because you continually evaluate, you continually improve each of those things that you're co-designing with people. And we're not just talking about people with disability here, we're talking about co-design as a general concept. The other thing it means is that you design with the end user. You design with the people in mind who will actually be using and working with what it is that you are designing, whether it be an advisory panel, whether it be a resource, whether it be a handbook, a pamphlet, a policy, a procedure. The people that it affects are involved in the co-design process to the extent that they can be. Now, this is primarily the reason that we have developed the client advisory panel. If I rewind 5 years ago, we started a series of customer reference groups across Scope. The reason we started those customer reference groups was to ensure that we were listening to the voices of the people that we support, so that we understood their experience of the products and services that they receive from us at Scope. Now we want to move beyond that. We understand that it's important not only to listen to our clients, but to directly work with them and co-design with them to have meaningful impact in the things that affect them on a day-to-day basis. And that means policy. That means procedure. It also means how we carry those things out. It means service design. It means all of those things that affect the people that we work with every day at Scope. Our board is committed to amplifying the voice of people with disability, and amplifying the voice in particular, and preferencing the voice of our clients. That's why we've made the changes that we've made. But we know it is a long journey. I'm not here today, contrary to your wonderful compliment earlier, Keith, I'm not here today calling myself an expert in co-design. We know that we are on a journey of trying to understand what that means for our clients. And we know we've got some hard work ahead of us. We know that we can't assume that we can co-design simply by creating these English documents. We know we can't call something co-design unless it really is. That is, unless we follow that process. Consultation is not co-design, but it is part of it. Informing is not co-design, but it is part of it. We need to make sure that we follow through on the promises that we make to the people we support and involve them from day one until the very end. And that's not something that we would have the capability of doing without the customer participation framework that Alison mentioned, and the coaching and mentoring and support within that. The last thing that I want to call out, though, is that it is not just the clients that need that coaching, mentoring, and support. We need to coach and mentor and support the people that support people with disability, because they are often the people that are going to enable the enablers of co-design, whether it be someone preparing to attend a workshop, whether it be someone understanding the initial information they receive, without bringing all of those support networks with us on the journey and involving them in the process, we cannot possibly fully achieve through co-design with and for people with disability.
Thank you very much, Zane. And I think you're making it really clear to us that we do not just go out and simply rebadge existing consultation processes and dress them up and call them co-design and co-production. Co-design and co-production might incorporate some consultation, but the process is far more sophisticated, far more distinct. And it's that commitment to working with the end user from the get-go, not necessarily coming to a group of people and saying, we need a policy about, what do you think? But maybe the first question is, what would you like a policy about? Where do you need a policy? But I'm also very much aware that co-design and co-production, you've reminded us, Zane, how important it's about having staff and service providers familiar with these processes, because co-design and co-production could be applied to, what are we going to have for dinner tonight in a situation of supported housing? It could be, what are we going to do this weekend? Co-design and co-production can be applied at the high policy development level, at the big ticket service development level, but the principles and practices of co-design can be applied on a very everyday level. So thank you very much. Please, we've got some questions coming into the Q&A box at the moment. I'd remind you to please put some questions into the Q&A box. And if you see a question that you'd really wish that you'd ask yourself, you've got the opportunity to vote that question up. Next on today's panel, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Dr. Paul Ramcharan. And Paul's had some interesting experiences over the years in co-design and co-production across the community services sector. And I'm going to ask Paul, what are some of the learnings that you've had? What are some of the things that might have gone off the rails that we need to be on the lookout for? What are some of the barriers that we should be alert for and planning to avoid?
Thank you very much, Keith. And Julie, if you might put up the PowerPoint slides, that would be very helpful. I just want to introduce this as a project where we started out with a conception and idea around the information linkages and capacity building part of the NDIS, in which people within communities were supposed to develop inclusive communities together. And the ILC funds different projects that are related to this. We started to do this in collaboration with Glenorchy City Council, and the group who were meeting met for over a year. So they were meeting on a weekly basis, sometimes 2 weekly basis. The first thing that I'd like to say that I agree with all the other presenters in that information consultation and then ideas around co-design were important to this. And we started out with the group looking at what the treasures were in Glenorchy. Oh, I should mention Christina David as well, and Katie Marks, who took part in this project, sorry. So the group was looking at all the treasures, the groups, the environment, the people, the places. They were collaborating with the local council to look at the things that needed addressing. And we sort of reversed the social relations of production. So effectively, we saw this group as a leadership group that was developing ideas which would answer local questions. If we can go on to the next slide, please. There were several things that enabled the project. Friends, independence, no red tape, links with the council, patience, shared lived experience, storytelling, and they identified a group of people with disability, that it was about civic duty and not just about disability. So what they wanted out of this was to develop an inclusive set of practices for a diverse community, not just for people with disability. That was their choice, and that's how they wanted to lead it. They wanted to collect data from people, which they did do. We had heaps of trouble in doing that, getting through the university's ethics committee. And in the end, the council decided to employ them as consultants who went out and talked to the community about their wishes and their needs. So we were connecting up to local issues with people in public. We couldn't use that data for research purposes because it didn't go through the ethics committee, but rather we were able to ask them what story they were going to be able to tell, given what they'd found out, which then became part of the research findings. You will note there that Tim Tams also featured very strongly in all of the group discussions. In fact, it was more than that. It was good times together, and there was a lot of food and things like that that were involved each time as well. So if we might just move on to the next slide, please. We can see that they came up with prototypes. Now, ordinarily within a co-design process, you've got one or more stages of ideation and design, where there are products or prototypes that are designed. And as we'll see shortly, there were sort of materials that were tactile, auditory, and so forth to create multi-sensory prototypes, so that increased accessibility for those who were taking part. So that had to be designed very carefully. The group decided they wanted to develop a prototype for a safer Glenorchy, working with the Glenorchy City Council on the Safer Communities Committee to redevelop the bus mall, which they wanted to do anyway. The church next door, which was not in use, shops and barbecue area, and possibly to develop a social enterprise hub. So these were all ideas that were generated through our co-design group. The second one was an informed Glenorchy prototype, which was a walking tour led by people with disability. I'm going to give you the fate of that one. The fate of that one was that at the end of the day, the council thought it was a great idea, but put it into a broader discussion around people with mental health problems and transferred it into that domain rather than the disability domain. And the third prototype was the Action Research Group itself, as a prototype which could go forward. That one, the fate of that one was something we wished to put into an ILC bid, but when the ILC tender came out, we didn't fit the criteria of what they wanted at that point in time. So the one that was left was the Safer Glenorchy prototype, and we went on to work on that. Next slide, please. Where, as you can see, we started to build up how to redevelop the bus mall and the church next door. This was part of the co-design process, which went on for a few weeks with a co-designer supporting us to develop what they felt was required within that space. In the end, the ideas were accepted by council, but then taken by council into their access committee. And because we didn't have the ILC funding, the people who'd been involved, the capacity that had been built over nearly a year was sort of lost. So I've got a few questions that I just wanted to ask, given the experience that I've summarily pointed out to you. The first is it sufficient co-design? Is it actually going to do the job? Well, probably not, if the actual co-production or the policy do not encompass everything, and that goes into a different process. It gets colonized. So how do you prevent colonization is one question that I have. Is it sufficient in another way? So, for example, this is an act of a local deliberative democracy approach. But will it work in every locality? Well, no, because every locality is different. So if you've got people involved in leadership, how do you do that on a much broader scale? In fact, in terms of the NDIS, for example, they've got 4 areas that the NDIS has chosen through sector representative groups. And again, they're only chosen areas, they're not every area. So who sets that agenda? Who holds the power? Is it transferable? Are the findings of co-design in relation to this project or in relation to policy, can they be transferred between one area and another? Are the prototypes transferable? And what does this imply about continued involvement of the people concerned? Because I think a lot of capacity is being lost. And just in relation to one of the questions by WWDA, you know, it's almost like there's recognition for a time and then people are ditched, and yet they've got all this expertise. So how do we place these people into the economy as a whole? How do we make leaders out of people with disability? How do we pay them and recognize them for their work, build on the capacities that they have, and engage over a longer period of time? Is it sufficient in terms of policy to have a representative model, to do a lot of consultation, but leave representatives to make decisions independent of a co-design process? And finally, the last question I'd like to ask is, what supports are needed for people with disability? We had a lot of need for support during the process, and there was a lot of boundary riding that was taking place to prevent others from trying to, in some ways, get hold of the decision making, and that sort of undermined the group and what it could offer itself. So there needs to be support, and that's just one aspect of support that I'm mentioning there. So look, as you can see, all of this involved all of the areas of Einstein's ladder, but the co-design process has specific elements to it, but there are troubles with the conception and the extent to which it can actually be ramped up into something rather more systematic. And that means that we really do need to build capacity and recognize people for the work that they do, and to recognize them long term and not just as a one-off. And I feel very guilty about the people who were involved. Many of them were asked onto committees, but many of them went back to the lives they had before we intervened. And I don't know, I carry on with a sense of guilt about that having happened. It wasn't the plan, but that's the way it ended up. So I'm going to end on that point and leave it there.
Thanks, Paul, for those candid, very honest reflections. This is not an easy process by any means. And I think going back to Zane's earlier point, we are all on a journey here. And I think today's webinar is certainly not intended to provide all the answers, but it's really signalling that there are many of us out here in the community, within the university, within organisations like Scope, and many I know who have signed on to today's webinar who are eager to know more. How can we do this thing called co-design and co-production with authenticity? This brings us to our last panel member, and I note that Paul has already started to answer some of our Q&A questions as he went. And I'm going to sort of throw to Rusty now. And in your experience, what are the key things that need to happen to make authentic co-design and co-production work? And maybe turning your mind to addressing some of those questions that we've already got in the Q&A, which go to the practicalities of how do we make this happen? Over to you, Rusty.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thank you to everyone else as well. There's some fantastic questions that have come up, and I think I had a little bit of a couple of talking points I was going to talk through, but I think I'm going to skip that and really just address some of the great questions that we've already got in the session. for me, like we've talked a lot about a lot of the important enablers for meaningful co-design. And often we talk about this to people who are actually doing the work. So conveners, people with disability, people in the community, frontline workers, all these kind of different types of players who are on the ground doing the work and who are most affected by the problems that we're trying to solve. But my real sort of call to action around enabling effective co-design is a challenge for the people in power. So I'm talking about in organizations, it's the executives, it's the boards, it's funders like the NDIA, and it's really sort of saying, you know, we need them to really understand what the process of co-design and what it takes to do it. And I go back to what some of the great points Zane made around, you know, this important about capability building and capacity building and engagement and relationships. So for me, it's really important that executives and people that are kind of at the top who've got the purse strings and arbitrarily decide on timelines, is that we actually need to have longer timelines around some of these initiatives. And those timelines are actually really focused on giving time for us to build relationships with each other, and to ensure that access needs are met that meet every individual's needs, rather than just having sort of a blanket set of accessibility changes to meet people's support needs, but actually making sure that they're individually met, and also ensuring people's safety. I think there's a question that came up around how do you engage people who've had traumatic experiences or who are scared to speak out. A lot of that is about trust. And there's a person called Adrian Brown from a book called Emergent Strategy, which says that we need to move at the speed of trust. And I think this is a really important way of thinking about this, that we're not moving at the speed of funders, we're not moving at the speed of executives, we're not moving at the speed of arbitrarily sort of set kind of timelines for things, that we need to actually work more flexibly and responsibly around building relationships and building trust. And I just go to that question around, you know, how do you ensure co-design is accessible to people with a range of needs? Well, we actually build that into the initial relationship building, where you get to know each other as human beings. You get to understand what support needs, who do you need to have there? What are your strengths? What are the things that you already know that you have that we can build on together in the co-design process? And it's also a great opportunity to say, right, well, you need things, certain communication needs, you might have sensory needs, you may have support needs where you need to have somebody with you when you're participating in co-design sessions. I think it's really important that that's not just, it's all about building trust with each other and getting to know each other. I would love to address just really quickly the one around views for continuing professional development, skill development and remuneration. 100%, there is no discussion. People with disability or people from the community who are involved in co-design, they are experts by experience. We have experts by professions, but we also have experts by lived experience. And they need to be equally remunerated for their time. And this is not sort of $20 at a gift card. This is actually working with them to understand what works for them and then remunerate them in a way that doesn't affect other things, but also is really, really recognizing that that expertise is just as important as the expertise that someone like me brings, or a service provider or an executive or a board member. It's equal experience. And then the final thing I really wanted to touch on is that it's a reciprocal thing, co-design. For me, from my experience, when it works the best, it's actually, you're not just taking information off people, you're actually learning together and exploring things together. And I think by sharing information and learning together and building each other's capability. So an example for me, I worked on a project over a year, and the amount that I learned about people's coping mechanisms, around people's ways of navigating the barriers in society. I learned so much about that, and actually then brought that into how I did co-design and how I ran sessions. And then for them, we made sure that people with lived experience were co-facilitating sessions. So they built their facilitation skills. And so over time, they now are doing talks. And I had one person who I worked with who, you know, went from not really liking doing presentations or standing up in front of people to doing a presentation at a national conference. Which is just an amazing thing around seeing capability building being a part of the co-design process, not just trying to reach this goal of making something. So they're the kind of key things I really wanted to touch on, Keith, and thanks very much for listening, and it'd be great to answer some of the other questions and give the other panelists a crack.
Terrific. Thank you, Rusty. I think you've really grounded us in many of the practical elements of what needs to be in place, and certainly relinquishment of power by those who hold power, the building of relationships. For me, the secret of good co-design and co-production lies in the fact that we didn't just have a meeting or 2 or 3 meetings, but that we've journeyed together over a period of time in building something that's important for our community. These processes can't be rushed. We've got some really great questions that have come through. We'll try and get through as many of them as we possibly can. Would anybody on the panel like to differentiate between co-design and co-production? Is there anybody who wants to have a go at that one?
Well, I think the primary distinction is the co-production moves into a situation in which the delivery of the prototype or what's been established through the co-design stage has then been turned into a product that has to be delivered, and the people who are involved would go on to be part of that production element. So it's about empowering people, not just in contributing to policy, but in generating services that are defined by ideas that have been developed by the people themselves. So it takes it a stage further, and it begins to establish that the necessity, I think, sometimes that, you know, people will themselves design those and create those services for delivery. So it goes even further than the design stage. That's the very basic sort of distinction between the two, I think.
Yeah, look, thanks, Paul. And I think it's a good reminder that the concepts of co-design and co-production don't come from our world of community service development or indeed social policy development, but are very much grounded in the wisdom of our colleagues from engineering and product design, who really get the fact that if you want to sell a widget, you need to involve the end widget user in actually saying what that widget's going to look like and how it's going to function. So I think we've got a lot to learn in the social policy and community services sector from our colleagues in engineering. There's a question that a couple of people have nuanced in a couple of different ways, but would anybody like on the panel like to comment on how we might go about engaging with people with complex communication support needs and maybe complex intellectual and developmental disability?
I don't mind having a crack at that, Keith.
Go for it, Zane.
So, first and foremost, it's a great question, and it's a question that it's a question that we continually grapple with every day. And when you go back and you think about the customer participation framework that Scope has created, I think that very question is the genesis of it, because when we think about people with disability and their desire and their willingness and their ability to participate, that's going to evolve. We don't start at co-design and co-production with very many people. Generally, it does start, Keith, right back at those day-to-day decisions, the choices that people make every day. What do I want to wear? What do I want to eat? Where do I want to live? Who do I want to be supported by? So those decisions are the decisions where our framework starts. And then as you build the capability, and not only the capability, but the confidence of individuals, and as Rusty alluded to earlier, you build up the relationship of trust and you get to know the individual over an extended period of time. That is what enables you to understand what a person needs and wants to communicate their ideas about more complex issues. That's when you get to understand the tools that somebody might require to be part of that conversation. You have to do the hard yards in the early days to really develop with the person the answer to that question. you won't know for a very long time whether a person might benefit from easy English or from talking maths or from some other communication system, or whether you need to in fact design something that is tailored to that individual to enable them to be part of those conversations. That takes time to work that out. But once you do, guess what happens? What happens is you become a trusted ally for that individual. And when they want to be part of another process with you, they come back again because they know that you are going to invest in them as an individual to enable them to have the conversations that truly need to be had and to meaningfully involve them in the process. And to go back to that balance of power thing, there's another point on this. When we think about working in partnership with people with disability, Rusty was absolutely bang on when he said we need to think realistically about timelines. There's no point going to a people with disability or a person with disability and saying you need to give us feedback on this policy and we need it in 10 days. That's not going to happen. Because what about the work that needs to happen in the background to build the person's confidence to speak up, to build their understanding of the information, and to create the tools that makes it possible for them to have the conversation? It takes time, and sometimes, even as a person who does this on a day-to-day basis, it feels, frankly, bloody impossible. But then these things happen where you see something work and you reward yourself for the fact that you put in the time and the effort, and more importantly, you reward the individual for their patience and their candidness in continuing to work with you. And that is how you involve people. You don't make assumptions about what people are going to need. You don't try and fit square pegs in round holes. You develop a solution that will work for each individual.
Thanks, Zane. A solution for each and every individual. I think we need to be really clear that when we're talking about co-design and co-production, we're not trying to get as many people together in one room and have a big talk fest. Co-design and co-production needs to be individualised to ensure that power imbalances are addressed and that everybody has a voice at the table. Look, one of the questions, time is getting away from us. We're going to try and answer a number of the questions that we've had offline. So we'll send out some offline answers if we haven't got to all your questions today. But look, there's a question there. Is co-design and co-production just about talking with people with disabilities and getting their voice to the table? Or is the co-design and co-production process broader than that? And what does the stakeholder group look like when we're authentically co-designing and co-producing policy and good practice?
I'd love to have a go at that, Keith.
Go for it, Rusty.
Look, I think it actually absolutely needs to evolve. If we're talking about relationship building and being able to share decision making and share knowledge, we need to have multiple types of participants or co-designers in the process together. So that's people with lived experience of disability, the staff that support them, administrative. So if it's in somewhere like an organisation, you know, the administrative staff who do the day-to-day stuff. And I think it's also really, really important to also include one or two people who are higher up in the decision-making process. So whether it's an executive. So I've had a situation before where the COO was a part of the co-design process, left her name badge at the door as COO, that we don't go into co-design sessions with titles. But what she did was she got to see the strengths and the skill sets and the abilities of people to be able to actively engage in deciding what works and what doesn't work and what we need and what we don't need, to see that firsthand, the capability of people in the co-design process. But also that's the relational capability building that happens because you have multiple stakeholders bringing different perspectives and worldviews into the situation. But I'd just like to make sure that one thing I really want to add in there, you don't just throw everybody into a room and say go, because there are definitely power imbalances that happen there. So it needs to be a really, you got to prepare for a process of building up people's capability on one end, and then also letting other people know that, yes, you come with expertise and you have a professional background and worldview, but you need to leave some of that at the door and give room for other people to have their voices heard. So it needs to be a managed process. But I think the more people involved from different perspectives, the more we work together as a group to actually solve some of the trickiest problems that are facing the community.
Thank you, Rusty. We're just coming up on the hour now. As I said, we've received lots of questions as we've gone along. We're going to try and answer some of those questions offline for various people as we go. The recording of today's webinar will be available, and please do make contact with us at the university if you've got any further questions going forward. I'd really like to just underline the fact that today's webinar was not about a group of know-it-alls telling you what to do. We're all struggling with how to do this, and this is why we wanted to kick off with today's webinar, because we'd love to build a community of practice around this, a community of learning where we can share our triumphs and our tribulations as well, and plan the way forward for authentic co-design and co-production to take root in our world, where we can redress the power imbalances. I think it's really important to remember from the discussion today that it's not about getting as many people as you can in the room. It's not about a 4 or a 6 week process. It is about prolonged engagement with people and building those relationships. And I come back to one of the principles or practices that I think could certainly inform our work going forward, the First Nations principle of understanding yarning. Extensive, deep conversations that involve deep, authentic listening, where the first premise is not to extract information, but to build relationships. And if that's where we start, we're probably on solid ground for our co-design and co-production going forward. I'd very much like to thank our panelists today, to Alison and Zane and Rusty and Paul. I'd like very much to thank Julie and for Jenny in the background, keeping our tech all in line. And I'd very much like to thank the Scope Australia University of Melbourne partnership for making today's webinar possible. I'll bid you all a very good day. Go forth and co-design.